folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. My name's Dan Levitt. This is episode 160 of this fine little program, created way back when. It's actually been 4 years, and I don't even think I mentioned that in any previous episode, but September 1st was the 4-year anniversary of the Podcast Digest, and because we've taken most of the last year off, I didn't think it was worth pointing out, but it is a thing, and that's what it is. So I hope you guys all enjoyed the interview with Skye Pillsbury from our last episode 159, where we talked to the wonderful Skye about her brand new show, Inside Podcasting, that's actually wrapping up as we speak on her first season 6-episode run. So go check that out and listen to that conversation from episode 159 if you've not done so. But it's time for this week, which is going to be a news-focused episode, and there is nobody in the world I'd rather talk news than my co-host on the Podcast Digest, Agent Palmer. Welcome, Palmer.
Thanks for having me back again.
Yes, indeed. This is the thing we do now. So we've got a lot to talk about in the world of news, of podcasting, as it seems to always be the case. But we have some in-house stuff that we'd like to talk about, specifically your side of the house, and the other side of the duct tape line of our wonderful Podcast Digest house is Agent Palmer World, and Palmer World has all kinds of news. So I'm going to yield the floor to the new goings-on of one Mr. Agent Palmer. Palmer, tell us about it.
Yeah, so shortly after our conversation with Skye Pillsbury, I launched the first episode of the Palmer Files. And then, you know, being an every 2-week show, I released another one 2 weeks later. I now have 2 episodes of a podcast that's my very own thing, which I think somewhere in the history of audio things, Dan called at some point.
Yeah, so, of course, I predicted all things. So you're, like, legit now. You've decided to move from the ever-warm, ever-preoccupied co-host chair, you've always said, or guest chair, if you will, to slide over to the much harder, much cooler, much more uncomfortable host chair, is what you're saying.
That is correct. And I couldn't have said it any better than you just did. Like, it's so vastly different. Even though, like, I've kind of done it before. All
right, so you got 2 episodes out, and more to come, obviously. Folks are going to find a link in the show notes to the Palmer Files, Agent Palmer's brand new show. Before we get onto the second bit of news regarding you, sir, what are people going to find in these first 2 episodes? Why should they go listen?
Well, the first episode is all about process and decision-making, where guest Bill Sweeney and I discuss a book called The Dip by Seth Godin, where I basically talk about the process of deciding to do the show. And in the second episode, I sit down with guest Kristen Meyer to talk about blogging, which predates my podcasting by some margin. And as a tease for everyone listening to this show, episode 3, when it does come out, will feature none other than the host of this fair show, Dan Levitt, where we talk about podcasting.
I heard that guy's terrible.
He's wonderful.
Terrible. Terrible,
you know
terrible.
You know what? You can't say anything bad about Dan. He's a great guy.
Well, if you want a 1-episode role reversal, if you will, not even true, because you're not a guest on the show anymore. But if you want to find my appearance as a guest, let's put it that way, my own personal role reversal, that's the Palmer Files, episode 3, dropping soon. Yes.
Dropping in 2 weeks as we record this.
And all kinds of things are dropping over in the world of Palmer. You are just full of news. And there may be some long-time followers of Agent Palmer that could be a little surprised in the past couple of weeks. Not just at you having a new show, which is earth-shattering enough, but there's more.
That's true. For the longest time, it was Palmer, and when I launched the podcast, I changed my Twitter name, not the @. The @ is still @Agent Palmer, but the name is now my real name. It's Jason parentheses Agent Palmer Stershik. And at some point, the parentheses is going to go away. It's more of like a transitionary thing. And for those of you who have already heard episode 1 or who are about to go listen to episode 1 of the Palmer Files, I introduce myself as Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, because, you got to put your name on it, right? And on my blog, that's in the About page, really. It's in the first line, but not everybody reads that, and I'm taking ownership of everything. So I, Jason, am Agent Palmer. It's not as glorious as saying, like, I am Batman, but
it's close.
It is what it is, and so, like, going forward, at least on this show, I think I'm just going to be Jason. So, not to confuse anybody, like, I'll still answer to Palmer.
And maybe we'll just co-opt like a Jason Palmer or something like that. I don't know. But Jason, it's good to hear about your first show. It was an awesome time to be your guest for episode 3. And I'm glad that we have now completed what I would consider this full-blown introduction of yourself to all these fine listeners at the Podcast Digest. Now, we've not only got you as a co-host for a couple episodes, but now we've unveiled your real name as well as been there to witness the launch of your own show. So now your full-fledged membership in the co-host chair at TPD is now bronzed and ready for full participation.
This is true. And I can also talk, like, I want to, like, and I apologize to Sky off mic. And I'll apologize to the listeners now. There were a few, like, I'm totally right there right now when Sky was going through and discussing, like, the launch of season 1 and, like, all of the trepidation that she was talking about and, like, the preparation and the getting ready to hit publish on that first one. I was literally going through it as she was talking about it.
Well, you definitely were able to empathize for sure. And
absolutely.
Sky was a great guest, and I hope you guys really enjoyed that interview. If you're just now landing on this one, go back and listen to episode 159. I think our conversation was pretty fun, and I know I learned a lot and I was having a great time, and I hope you guys did listening to that too. But so that's the news from the world of Jason. Who he shall be officially known as moving forward. So let's move on to this week's show here on the Podcast Digest. We've got some news to talk about, and stick around. We've got a new segment that Jason and I have been workshopping now, if you will, that we're going to feature at the end of this episode. So hang out, and let's talk some news, and let's talk some news here with our first topic. And as we did in our last news episode, all the links for everything we're going to talk about will be in the show notes. So if I don't state it when we're going through, just check the show notes if you want to read more about anything that we're about to discuss. So our topic 1 is focusing on NPR. And you're like, wait a minute, this is Podcast Digest. This is not NPR isn't podcast. It's National Public Radio. Well, that's true, and it has been for a very long time with affiliates all over the country. But unless you've slept under a rock, NPR has been in the podcast game for a good bit of time. They were somewhat early adopters. This American Life was turned into a podcast way back when, if you will. And it was basically a repurposing of their radio show on Sundays that was broadcast to the NPR affiliates, put out in podcast form. And even that's done a little bit of evolution because now they release an unedited version. That's the podcast. It's not the beeped radio version. And so there is a few enhancements, if you will, although primarily it's still the radio story publish and podcast. And NPR, of course, built on that, as This American Life is a very successful podcast. I've been a listener for I don't know how long to This American Life. Say what you want about its radio roots. It is still a phenomenal listen week in and week out. And some of my favorite episodes that drop in my subscription bucket on a regular basis. But they've expanded a lot. There is now all kinds of shows under the NPR umbrella, from the national NPR label, if you will, to a lot of the smaller market affiliates that now have their own shows. Everybody sort of in the NPR world has expanded into the world of podcasts, and they are starting to see huge benefits from that. In fact, an article out just in the past week or so, or a couple of weeks since our last news episodes, has stated that NPR projects it's going to earn more sponsorship revenue from podcasts than their radio stations for the first time in 2020. It is projected that next year they will have about $55 million in corporate sponsorship revenue from podcasts next year, and that compares to the $50 million for their radio programming. And that's pretty amazing when you think about, yes, they've been out there for a while, but really like the big push into podcasting where they're actually investing money into some of their podcasts that weren't broadcast on radio. It was only about 4 years or so where NPR really kind of turned a corner and pushed on the podcast medium, and now there's original NPR podcasts, and there's the NPR One app, which is a really cool listening tool as well. We'll talk a little bit more about apps later, but the fact that a major player like this that transitioned from the traditional broadcast world into the podcast space is now saying, guess what? We're about to make more money from podcasting than their traditional revenue stream is a pretty big deal. What do you think, Jason?
I'm so excited for them on multiple levels because, number one, NPR is public radio, so they get most of their money the way public television does, which is I don't know what it is for most stations. I think my local NPR station is quarterly. They do like a week or a weekend pledge drive.
Right.
And, I mean, there's other funds, but the majority of their funding comes from pledge drives. And as radio listenership goes down and podcast listenership goes up, since they're in both platforms, it's good to know that they're still sustainable and that shows like This American Life are not going anywhere. Because that's always been the fear, I think, for people that listen to NPR is that, like, well, what happens when there is no more pledging and income? And it also speaks to the changing business model of not only radio and podcasting, but just in general, where you look at not only an advertising model, but a patron model where maybe somebody's willing to give a show X amount of dollars that they wouldn't give NPR, right? Some people want to know their money's going to that show versus that network. It can be that simple. And from a fundraising standpoint, and I've been in the nonprofit sector before, I think this just makes all of the content we're going to get from them easier to create and easier to go out and get more like independent voices, which is something that NPR has really strived to do and be a place of many voices.
And
really.
I want you to continue, Jason, but I want to jump in just for a second in something that is sourced in this current.org article that we're going to link in the show notes that sort of speaks to exactly what you're talking about. That NPR, while they are starting to see some real benefits from their play in the podcasting space, the impact is much, much larger. And you've alluded to this with sponsorship drives and the like, but just this quick quote from this article says, podcast sponsorship revenues are helping to fund initiatives throughout NPR. CEO Jarl Moan mentioned that it pays for the international bureaus, for the increased election coverage, and for all the special content in the news magazines and so forth. The bulk of the revenue from podcasts is being plowed back into the news department and the news magazine. So it is helping fuel a lot of these things that, to your point that you mentioned sort of at the outset, one used to wonder what would happen to all those things in the future. And now we can see podcasting is actually going to help keep those things alive.
And that's just that. I mean, this is on a national level. I think that the next big article we're going to see is that some of the larger markets are going to have similar things happen, right? Like, I mean, I actually have access to my local NPR station and the Philly NPR station. So I can actually listen to two different NPRs from local from a local perspective. And I would guess that I'm in a much smaller market than Philly, but Philly has that potential with their local programming to start generating separate income like the national level is doing. And that's exciting because then it probably just gets more money put back in the community. So I'm all for this. I'm excited for this on so many levels. This was genuinely one of the first new podcasting news articles that made me actually smile.
Absolutely. It was, I too think it was huge news. And to be fair, if anybody doesn't know, and I'd be shocked if you're listening to this show and you don't know this, Jason alluded to the Philadelphia NPR. The Philadelphia NPR is WHYY. WHYY, if you've never heard of that, again, I want to know about this rock you're living under, but they are the actual original home of Fresh Air with Terry Gross. So that Terry Gross is right here in Philadelphia. This is where she kind of started. This is where she still works, where she still broadcasts out of. So, yes, the Philadelphia NPR station is kind of a big deal, and a lot of that has to do with Fresh Air and Terry Gross. So, just to kind of put a little context on that. So,
Dan, before we leave this topic, I do want to ask, your first introduction to NPR. Was there somebody listening to it when you were a kid? Did you come to it later in life?
I think it was something I heard growing up. I cannot remember the guy. Who was the Last Word guy? Paul something. Last Word with so-and-so. I cannot remember now.
I can't either.
I imagine a Google search will probably get this for me. But it was Last Word with Paul, not Combs. I don't know. That's what Google just suggested. But there was something about some guy, I'm from upstate New York, that used to do that, and I can't remember. And I may not be remembering correctly. But in my more teenage and adult years, it was This American Life. I mean, This American Life, to me, I remember listening to it on the radio before podcasts even existed. This American Life is, and I think will continue to be, a standard bearer for audio storytelling in American culture. And it is still to this day. Yes, there's some episodes that don't necessarily hit home as much, but I would say there's not a consistent show I listen to week in and week out that hits me harder, opens my eyes wider, or leaves me thinking / Googling something more frequently than This American Life.
I remember as a child listening to Fresh Air because my father would listen to Fresh Air. And I remember the theme song, which amazingly, while they've changed it a little bit, is exactly the same. It can make me feel like a kid again, even when I'm listening to it on my own commute home from work. But really, my NPR introduction was Garrison Keillor on what I think at the time was Saturday night. And that's where it really became a thing. And it's not really the 30-second Garrison Keillor to podcaster Jason, is that in between that, my senior project in college was a 1-hour radio program that I wrote, recorded, and produced.
Oh, when we were young.
Yes.
And I just want to double back before we get to our next news topic. Quick Google search. I figured it out. Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey, the rest of the story with Paul Harvey. That's what it was.
Nice.
Which I just Googled, and it was NPR, so I was remembering that piece right. The one thing that just kind of shocked me a little bit, it says, pop culture, this is a story from 2014. The rest of the story, Paul Harvey, conservative talk radio pioneer. Which is ironic, because if anybody knows me, I am not at all conservative, but apparently I grew up with a conservative talk radio pioneer when I was just a wee boy. So, oh well, that's what it was. I also didn't become a Transformer or a G.I. Joe, so I guess, childhood influences are what they are. So, that's that. So let's hop on to our second topic, which comes from Jason.
Yes, there was a very interesting article from The Verge at the beginning of this month. And it talked about YouTube creators are turning this site, meaning YouTube, into a podcast network. They're launching secondary channels beyond their primary ones where they're just dropping audio content. And I feel like this is one of those things where the oral traditions that we learn about, like, as a kid, when you're talking about, like, you know, this is how traditions are passed down, whether it's in school or in Sunday school or just your parents. Listen, there's a reason that the podcast format works so well and that radio hasn't died off. And I mean, it seems only natural. Dan, I know it's video, but how do you react when, you know, you read that YouTube is a podcast network?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that it is. The Podcast Digest has been published on YouTube since I started. Through our hosting, we do provide a link auto to a YouTube channel that I've got that publishes this show on YouTube. Podcast Digest is there as well. And I do know I get notifications 6 or 8 a week, if you will, of maybe 4 to 6 of new subscribers to the Podcast Digest channel. And that is because of a couple of different reasons. One, and this is something that you, Jason, and me need to always constantly remind ourselves. And, you know, my kids are now a little bit grown, but I spent a lot of years with them in the house. And even then, and this was several years back, YouTube is everything in the sense that it is what used to be for us HBO or Cinemax, or a few years later, Sirius or XM. YouTube is all of that and more. YouTube is bigger and more important than Netflix to these kids. YouTube is bigger and more important than, Amazon Prime Video. It is bigger and more important than Twitter, than Facebook, than Snapchat, than all of it. It is a prime everything for them when it comes to entertainment, free time, or anything. It is YouTube. So when you say that podcasting is starting to creep in there, one, it's smart. Two, it doesn't surprise me. YouTube Music is a thing. A lot of these videos are being co-opted and popped into YouTube Music. So an audio-only focus in that way makes sense. YouTube is it's not going anywhere. It's here to stay. It's a behemoth in the space of, be it social networks or entertainment delivery vehicles or however you want to sort of slot it. And it doesn't surprise me that kind of celebrities and big YouTubers are realizing there's another way to reach their audience. And for a lot of these, in this article that we're going to link in the show notes, they talk about a couple of the tech podcasters. Marquez Brownlee is MKBHD is somebody who I've followed for a very long time, being a tech fan. And since I've had this show, the Podcast Digest, for the last 4 years, I've always envisioned and imagined. And you know what? I think if I go back even 2 or 3 years to my sent email, I may have even emailed Marquez once and asked him to be a guest on this show. And actually, I did have a tech YouTuber. There's only been one YouTuber in the history of the Podcast Digest that has been a guest on my show, and that was Austin Evans. And if you look at Austin Evans, he has literally millions of subscribers. And we talked a lot about that medium, and he was great on the podcast. So often YouTube creators, they have the ability to communicate. They have the ability to get a message across. They're interesting people, and the visuals are not necessarily the most important part. They have stories to tell, and the idea of these folks moving over to the podcast medium, to me, just makes sense.
And I want to go back to, if anybody's not familiar, Dan's right when he goes through that list. Like, YouTube is not the first thing that I go to, but the generation behind us and the generation behind them, it is the first thing they go to. And yes, the Podcast Digest, even the Palmer Files, you can find it. Like, I put that stuff on YouTube as well. But it doesn't have to be video. It's not like we're taking this show and we're recording us talking into the mic. It's just a, solid, logo and here's my episode. But it's there. And while there are YouTubers who probably keep the camera on themselves when they're recording and it's more than just a static image, it doesn't have to be. And that's where even when you get into, you mentioned YouTube Music, not all of YouTube Music is an actual video. So YouTube is kind of a platform of all platforms. And what makes it more unique and what makes it more important than, say, a Facebook or a Twitter or any podcast catcher, at the moment at least, is that YouTube's algorithm and search is that of Google's, which means it's always evolving and it's always trying to get the most relevant information to the top. So it's more reliable if you want to look up anything on YouTube than it is, say, in random video site or on, Podcatcher X. And I don't mean to put those places down, but it's one of those things that makes YouTube that much more important.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about those places in just a little bit. But YouTube algorithm. Yeah, if you just watch, a dozen, recommended for you videos in a row and just let them autoplay, you always end up on Nazis, right? I think that's been proven at this point. All YouTube video recommendations ends up on Nazis.
I wasn't talking about recommendations so much as the actual search, which is relevant. Yeah. The recommendations are, I feel like those are the things that are just going to get tweaked beyond. And
because they all end up in Nazis.
And if you want to be safe, just whatever you do, go log into your Gmail account and subscribe to the YouTuber of your choice. But if you don't want the recommendations, just watch them incognito. But make sure you subscribe first, because even incognito, they get credit for the view or the watch or the listen.
And it all doesn't surprise me in terms of YouTube's growth there. I think one of the things that is interesting about this article, and we'll close out this topic with this statement, is the concept that, the Verge article opens with a statement at the end with a quote, bona fide podcast network. I would take a little umbrage with that statement, but I wouldn't take umbrage with the concept that YouTube is a podcast delivery vehicle. Its idea of it being a podcast network's a little different. Network, I look at a lot of different things in terms of that, applying that label, some of which is things like cross-promotion, administrative support, things of that nature. YouTube's not doing any of that stuff. So it's a liberal application of the term network. But be that as it may, that's a minor tweak. Point taken for what they're actually trying to say, which is that, it is a medium now where people are listening to and consuming a vast amount of podcasts, which is cool.
It is.
All right, let's go to our next topic there, Jason. You good with that?
I am.
Good. We exhausted the YouTube conversation. That's good. Let's go to the next one, which is one of my favorite conversations, so I will not try to go too long-winded, but it is about podcast apps. I am an iOS user. I've said that many times on the show, although I do have an Android tablet that I'm actually about to retire. Again, a whole nother conversation. But so I have a little dabbling in the Android space, but mostly on iOS. And I've used on iOS them all. And I mean all.
Hold on. I find it hilarious that I am your mirror in this way. Like, I am an Android phone user, but I have an iPad that I dabble in from time to time.
So it's great. We'll be able to present the full scope of the, passionate listener experience, let's say. So on iOS, though, I have literally tried them all. And I mean almost them all. Like, I probably every month or two will search the word podcast player in the App Store and see if anything new has come out. Although, I'm monitoring news pretty regularly and I'm usually aware of new releases. So I've tried them all. And for years, one of the biggest ones in the space has been PocketCasts. Probably, if you're listening to this show, the Podcast Digest, you've heard of PocketCasts, right? I mean, it's been a big player for a very long time. Except has been a lot of change in PocketCasts. PocketCasts started out way back when as one of the first applications that did true cross-platform syncing. So as Jason just said, and as I've said, I have had multiple devices across platforms. I had that Android tablet, but I was primarily on iOS. Well, Jason has an iPad and otherwise is on Android. PocketCasts is one of the only apps that you can actually install and listen across platforms, and everything syncs. Your subscriptions, even your play progress on an individual episode, PocketCasts did all of that. And as far as I was ever aware, it was one of, if not the only one, who did that and did it well and did it reliably. I know that there's other cross-platform apps like Stitcher and things of that nature, but in terms of kind of a dedicated player, PocketCasts was one of the few who did this. And they even had a web player, which kind of comes into this story a bit. It was $9 a year, and I would actually pay for that because I could listen in my old day job. I'd be able to listen right in my office, have it coming through the PC speakers while I was working. It was great. So, but PocketCasts in the last few years has been through a lot. Its biggest thing was it got sold and bought. It got sold by Shifty Jelly, which was the developers who originally launched the application. If you're a tech fan like I am, Russell Ivanovich was one of the developers. He used to be the co-host of the Material podcast on Relay FM, one of my favorite tech networks that I've been tweeting about a lot here lately. And they sold it. And they sold it to a conglomerate, again, kind of tying to our first story of NPR / Radio Public / several different entities in the public radio space who bought it from Shifty Jelly, and they now own it. Well, the news this week, bringing it back to current, is that they've changed their monetization model. PocketCasts used to be a purchase upfront application. You'd buy it one time, you'd have it. You'd have to buy it on different platforms. So if you bought it on iOS, then you had to buy it on Android. And if you wanted that web version I talked about earlier, you had to buy that too, which, by the way, I have done all of those. And now they've switched to, and this is something that is very in vogue in the iOS App Store and probably over in Android as well, switching to a subscription model, where you can pay X amount a month or a year and have access to the full feature set of the apps. And they switched to, I believe it's 99 cents a month or $9.99 a year. Yeah, 99 cents a month or $10 a year for the subscription plan. Now, this kind of created a bit of a brouhaha because of sort of what I just said, which was in the past, I had bought the iOS app, I had bought the Android app, and I had bought the web app. And now, PocketCasts, the app, was saying, I need to give them more money. Now, while I personally am no longer a PocketCasts user, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit, but a lot of people who were current PocketCasts users, after spending, that much or more similar contributions towards PocketCasts, people got, and I can understand a little bit justifiably so, a little upset at that. Now, I have no problem with subscriptions. The app that I currently use is a subscription, and I love it, and I think I get great value. But if you had previously bought the app or bought the app in multiple ways and then only to find out that a subscription was necessary, it made folks a little upset. So what do you think of that, World Palmer? Or Jason? It's going to be a hard habit for me to break.
Yeah, it's going to be an adjustment. No, I use Stitcher, which from all accounts followed a different path, but followed PocketCasts' lead, because Stitcher was across multiple devices, and they have a web player. And up until a couple years ago, they were always free, and now they bought Earwolf at one point, and then that became their premium. So what was Earwolf Premium became Stitcher Premium. And while that's the one I use, I understand where everyone's coming from, but one of the things that I don't understand is I get the initial reaction of like, I thought this was, I buy it once and I'm good, and now it's subscription. But this isn't the first app that's happened with. And it's not going to be the last. And I mean, and maybe it's a generational thing, because I come from, I, I, I end up being like the IT professional for a lot of friends. And one of the things that's the most common conversation that I have these days is, why do I need Office 365 when I can just buy it and then it's good for forever? And we all know it's never good for forever. It's good until the next version, or it's good until that computer dies and not... Listen, we're beyond that kind of ownership for software. I think that in general, it's kind of going away. The subscription model is the way to go. And while you can still get Microsoft Office 2019, will you be able to get 20 or 21? Probably not. It's probably going to be Office 365 or nothing. That's the way I look at every other app. And maybe Office and Microsoft will go with the Google equivalent, which is Google Docs is free to a point, and then you pay for something. And that's what PocketCasts has done. And I feel like that's just the way software is going in general. And while it's happening in podcasts, it is a larger discussion, which is why I can pull that out, because it's just the way. And the expectation is, again, it's generational. Dan, you and I grew up with, well, if I could keep this computer running, all the software on it's good, and it's never going to go bad. That's just not the way of the world anymore. In fact, our older phones lasted longer than our current phones probably will.
Well, and one of the things I think is happening here, and as somebody who has been a tech aficionado for years, I mean, some of the first podcasts I listened to 10 plus years ago were tech focused. I'm just a junkie. It's one of my passions. It's one of my interests. I'm really big into consumer tech. It's just something that's always been an interest for me. One thing that I'm very well aware of, because I've heard podcast after podcast after podcast and read article after article after article from developers, the people who make this software. And there is a giant disconnect in the larger world with those individuals. People love things free. It's a free app. That app costs $1.99? I'm not going to buy that. It is, where is there a free version? Is there something free I can get? I want the free one. I don't want to pay $1.99 when I'm going to pay 4 times that for my coffee on the way to work this morning that I'm not going to get to drink because I'm stuck in traffic and it's going to get cold and I'm going to throw it out and I won't even care. But $1.99 for an app? No way. And that disconnect is what has caused these developers, and a lot of developers, the people who work day in and day out on programming and coding and supporting and fixing and upgrading and changing these apps we all use and love. If people won't give them $1.99, what are these people supposed to do? How are these people supposed to pay their mortgage or support their families and keep doing this work to create something we all love? And podcasts is a perfect example of it. Podcasts, and if you're listening to the show, you spend probably hours and hours and hours a week listening and enjoying and learning and laughing and sharing this audio listening experience. But so many people are just going to say, well, I'm just going to do the free one. I want the free Apple Podcasts app, and I don't want to pay for a podcast, and it's free. I want everything free. Well, the reality is that's not how business gets done. And if you think that that's how it should be, if you're one of those people out there who only wants free apps, who only wants, doesn't want to pay anything for a podcast or this, that, and the other, then I have 2 questions for you. 1, can you quit your job and not get paid? And 2, try walking into a movie theater without paying and see where that gets you. And that's the disconnect. Everybody understands that if you want to go see a movie, you got to pay for it. Everybody also understands that they need a job because they have bills they have to pay for. But for some reason, people look at the phone in their hand and don't kind of progress on, put together the math in their head that somebody had to take the time to create this. And I'm going to use this every day, 3 times a day, 8 times a day, 12 times a day, but I'm not going to pay anybody for this. And that's where we start to see things like subscription plans, because we did sell this app to you, and guess what? Nobody else is buying it anymore. And guess what? We've run out of money. So if you want this thing to keep happening, then we need to ask for more money. And that's kind of where I think this whole topic's at.
Yeah, and anybody out there who's like, well, there's got to be another way. Well, there is, but it doesn't work for podcasts. The other way is the free-to-play model, which is, and I'm sure anybody who's played a game, period, the end, and especially a mobile game, over the last 3 years knows the free-to-play model. But if you haven't, or you just don't play games on your phone, it's, all right, here's the content of the game. You can complete the game. But it's not going to be as easy unless you get this premium currency. Most free-to-play games have 2 kinds of currencies. And while you can earn the premium currency, it's not easy. It's log in for 10 days straight or do this 10 times, whatever it is, versus here's $5, here's your premium currency. You don't have to do that for 10 days.
Coins and gems and tokens and emeralds and
all of these things, but that only works in a game sphere. That's the other. When you generalize it to apps, that's the only other option. There is no way to generate premium currency within a podcast app, except when you talk about a free ad-based podcast player versus a premium player with no ads or less ads, because they're not going to scrub ads from the episodes, and, extra content through some creators. And that's kind of basically the model that's going to exist, especially when we're talking about what I feel like it kind of denigrates them, but I don't know what else to call them when you're talking about these third-party podcast platforms, which is something that's not Apple and not Google, and Android itself doesn't actually have one, which
not one pre-built in, right?
Not one pre-built in, and I feel like that's part of the discussion. So I'm an Android phone user, and I use Stitcher. And why do I use Stitcher? Well, honestly, I'm invested in it. When Google launched Play and said that Google Play would have podcasts in it, I attempted to use Google Play. And then they came out with Google Podcasts. But I had learned my lesson from Google Play, and that was I'm too invested in Stitcher. And then Spotify came out, and I like what Spotify does for that. But I'm too invested in Stitcher. I have multiple playlists and so many shows. And when it came to Google, not everybody was on there. And when it comes to Spotify, again, not everybody's on there. But everybody I already listened to, and I want to say that if you combine all of the 4 or 5 playlists that I have in my Stitcher, you're talking about 120 shows, which means if I move to another podcatcher, I'm either going to lose some of those shows, I either want to do a purge, or I have to track down all of those again. So if you haven't invested, or you're only subscribed to 3 or 4 shows, I urge you, check out all of them. And if you really like PocketCasts, great. Then
I was going to say, PocketCasts actually is probably your best alternative kind of to bring this all around. And pay for the 99 cents a month, Jason. But on a quick side note, technical note, because I'm that guy, does Stitcher not allow you to export your subscription list as an OPML file?
If it does, I didn't look into that option.
You should look at super tech support. We're stealing from Reply All, previous guest on the podcast digest, Alex Golden. Super tech support. This is your homework, Jason, for now to the next episode. See if your Stitcher app for Android allows you to export your subscription list as an OPML file. If it does, then you can import that file into any other player, including PocketCasts.
Okay, I will I will report back.
That would be great.
Mission accepted.
It's an interesting topic, folks. I'd love to hear from you at Pod Digest or at Agent Palmer. Tweet us both. What player are you using now? What's it, monetization method? Are you happy with it? Are you looking around at other options? I didn't even say it in my rant, so I'll say it now. I am a Castro user. Ironically enough, I know it is a very, very small share of the market nowadays. But I got hooked on one thing, which was their concept of inbox. You get all your subscriptions. Every episode drops in a box. You pick from that box to create an inbox that you listen through. And that's it. It's clean. It has dark mode, light mode, and it is that simple. It doesn't chew up a bunch of space because I have a ton of subscriptions. That's my problem with some competitors on iOS. It downloads everything in advance and takes up all the space on my phone. This only downloads the first 10 episodes in your inbox and kind of scrolls through as you play each one. It deletes it automatically and it downloads the next one in the 10. So my first 10 is always ready. You can sort the order of play. They've got, voice boost. They've got skip silence. They've got all that fun stuff, different icons, all that. Castro I've been a Castro Plus subscriber since they launched it, and I too pay basically the same. I think it's $12.99 a year. And you know what? For $1 a month, effectively, I am a voracious podcast consumer, and I think for $1 a month, that's worth that element of entertainment in my life. So Castro on iOS for me, or you can do your Stitcher on Android thing like Jason.
Well, I do want to say, if you do tweet us, I would like to ask an additional, first, if you could screenshot, and obviously you don't have to remember, write it down. You don't have to, blatantly screenshot yourself, your podcatcher listening to the Podcast Digest. But I'm curious to see what the other ones look like, because I've seen a lot of people take screenshots of iOS, and I know what mine looks like, obviously.
Google Play, Jason. Google Play, they include screenshots in there.
No. Screenshots of what your app looks like. Take a picture of... Yep. No, I can do that. I know what they look like. I want to see what the listeners' apps look like. And if it's not too much to ask, one thing you like about your app and one thing you don't, if there is, in fact, something you don't, because I'll use this. If it's Android compatible, I will use the listeners for suggestions, in addition of not only finding out if I can export my stuff, but I'll use the listeners as a way to figure out where I'm exporting this to.
There you go. Tell Jason, you got to get off this Stitcher thing. There's so many better options. Tell him about PocketCasts, or tell him about Google Podcasts, or tell him about whatever it is. I know there are plenty of Android. I know there is Podcast Addict. There is a couple others out there I know that a lot of folks listen to. I've heard from you in the past when I've brought up this topic. So tell Jason what he needs to be on and get him off the Stitcher thing, because there are a lot better places for what he's trying to do. So, but we got one more topic left,
yes,
right? Jason, tell me about it.
Dan, if I told you could get paid to listen to podcasts, would you believe me?
No.
Okay, well, for a half a minute it worked, right?
Somebody believed it.
Apparently Podcoin, which was an app that promised to pay you to listen to podcasts, it shut down today as we record this, because it just didn't work out. One of the quotes said, because it just failed to sustain momentum. And as a guy who listens to podcasts, I didn't even know about it. What momentum?
Yeah.
But if anyone's curious or doesn't remember this, Podcoin was basically a cryptocurrency for listening to podcasts. You would earn Podcoin, basically, like Bitcoin. And you could redeem your Podcoin for headphones or gift cards or what have you. And the company actually referred to the act of listening to podcasts as Podcoin mining, as if we weren't trying to really go even further into the Bitcoin likeness. But it didn't exist. It didn't last. It doesn't really get going. Dan, were you ever intrigued by this?
No.
And
no.
Are you surprised that it went away?
No, not at all. Not intrigued, not surprised. And I think this kind of scratches this itch. If anybody has ever thought about this, and I have been down this road a million times, right? You ever seen this paid to stay at home and take surveys?
Yes.
Paid to do blank, secret store shopper, keep all the goods and all this other stuff. Look, it's like I've told my kids over the years. If something sounds too good to be true, it's because it is. There's a reason why these highfalutin, pie-in-the-sky, seemingly ridiculous concepts never seem to work out or be successful. Why none of them ever become some super successful venture that becomes part of mainstream life. These type of ideas never become a Netflix. They never become an Uber or Lyft or Spotify or whatever the case may be. There's a reason for that, is that they're not based in reality. The article that Jason and I found kind of said, it may have been a good idea to kind of advertise or launch with this concept, get paid to listen to podcasts. Well, that's a great way to get kind of attention, right? Because that's a unique idea, a concept that's like, oh, yeah, sure. But the reality is it's not a unique idea. It sort of goes right in the same bucket of everything else I just mentioned, right? The surveys or the store shopping or whatever the case may be. It's just applied to the medium we all happen to love, and some people gave it a go. And I don't blame them for giving it a go, because you wonder sometimes. If you think about some of the biggest things in the world, I mean, I remember listening to a recent daily podcast, the Daily New York Times, the Daily, and they were talking about how Uber's having so much trouble being profitable. They talked about somebody who had gotten in on Uber literally its first few months and invested $5,000. That after it IPO'd and hit the stock market, they cashed out the shares they got and made $22 million on a $5,000 investment 7 or 8 years ago. 7 or 8 years later, they made $22 million.
Well, I mean, that's a good return on investment, but it also leads me to think of the things that I remember when Pinterest first blew up. There was an article that somebody using Amazon's affiliate links was making $1,000 a day on Pinterest just by posting affiliate links.
Right.
And I think Pinterest then kind of put a squash on that because it was more spammy than they wanted it to. But both kind of go to the same point, right? Which is there are these 1 in a million shot things that tend to work out, but you have to be in the right place at the right time. And for the rest of us who aren't that 1 in a million, it's just too good to be true.
Right. And you have to see something, right? You have to envision something becoming big. To be fair, a lot of them don't, right? A lot of VCs, a lot of venture capitalists are simply here's 5,000, here's 5,000, here's 5,000, because that's what they do, right? Bet on 20 things. If one wins, then all the investments are worth it, because it doesn't matter that 19 failed because one won, and all of a sudden you're extremely profitable because one won. So a lot of what that early investors, that's how some of the stupidest ideas in the world still get investment, because they're one of those 20, luminary. I didn't say that out loud, but it's that concept where that's how, when you hear about a group or an idea or an app or a service or something get all this investment, you're like, how in the world did this thing raise $20 million? I don't understand that. I've got a better idea than that. Well, this is how. Because venture capitalists will simply spread out all their smaller investments, and the idea that eventually, if you spread out, cover the market enough, eventually there's going to be a winner in there. And there's going to be a Lyft. There's going to be an Uber. There's going to be a Facebook. There's going to be a Spotify. You find the one, and all you need to do is find that one. It makes everything else worth it and really irrelevant, because it doesn't matter if it fails or not. So that's how I think some of things like this even get any type of attention. Because the idea behind Podcoin was the longer you listened, you'd earn, quote, Podcoins. You would then be able to, as Jason was saying, renew that for gifts. I mean, think about what's happening here. The idea is that you're rewarding / effectively paying listeners to listen longer. What could go wrong with that, really? I mean, you don't even have to be a genius to understand where this could all go sideways.
But I feel like where they went sideways in the very beginning was that you had to use their app. And we just spent time talking about podcast apps where, listen, there are people, and Dan, you've jumped around from app to app, but right before you made those jumps, that was your app. It's so personal because podcasts are so personal. Listen, they don't want to give it up. I mean, that's the other thing. Yes, okay, Dan, you pay $12 a year to use your app in a premium mode. But you probably only listen enough according to Podcoin. And they don't really have any numbers, so I'm just going to make it ridiculous because that's probably what it is. What you listen to on a weekly basis will earn you 25 cents. There's no way that it's sustainable otherwise. So, Dan, can I pay you $0.25 to use my app instead of the one that you've already invested in? It's a personal choice. I feel like right there from the get-go, they lost.
Yeah, exactly. And the rewards certainly weren't sufficient, right, to cause somebody to look away from their investment. You know what I mean? And this kind of compares and contrasts to what we talked about last month with PodPass, which was a very different approach where it was basically kind of trying to create a key and lock mechanism to allow folks to access premium content through a pay mechanism. But this one is very different in the sense that it's kind of looking at, we want to reward listeners. I mean, look, if you give them benefit of the doubt, you can kind of see where the play here is, right? Is that you tell people if you listen more, you get points that you can redeem for prizes. That means you get more people into the app to use. Then you go back to creators and say, hey, look at all these people I've got listening. We want money from you so you can be in our app. And then all of a sudden the best shows are in the app. And then all of a sudden everybody decides to come back over to listen in the app because the best shows are there, right? You can kind of like connect in your head logically where this may have gone, but wow, this was a huge kind of like leap of faith conceptually on something that may ultimately lead to something good, but it was never going to happen. It's too many leaps of faith, too many pie in the sky ideas, too many like if this, then that, then maybe, and ultimately it didn't work out. What can you do?
I don't know. You can dream. I mean, listen,
you can fold your entity in 8 months, which is what they did.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other part of this is for anybody out there who's thinking they've got the next big idea, like we're not talking about don't dream, but maybe I don't know, temper expectations. I don't know.
A little bit.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, those were our 4 news topics. I think we covered them exhaustively. Great job, Jason. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Dan.
Well, before we leave all you guys, I did preview it earlier, and we want to tell you about a new segment that we've got right here in the Podcast Digest. We're calling it The Holdover. And what does that mean? These are things that we're going to tell you that we are listening to, watching, reading, consuming, being entertained by, our entertainment choices that we would like to share with you guys as something that might hold you over until the next episode of the Podcast Digest. So let's start with Jason.
I found out that Joseph Gordon-Levitt has a podcast, and it's still in its infancy. I think there's only like 5 or 6 episodes. And I say I think because I literally found out there was a podcast and then listened to all of them in like 2 days. It's called Creative Processing, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt, if you don't know him as an actor, you may know him from Hit Record, which is this community of artists he's built that they just collaborate. And one of the unique things is his podcast is based off of answering a question, and then he goes into his Rolodex of not only celebrities. I mean, he had Ryan Johnson on, but like all these people he's met through Hit Record, and he picks the best person to have a discussion that helps answer that one question. Yeah, it's gone to my favorites playlist. I'm all caught up. It is fantastic, and I cannot suggest it or recommend it enough.
Awesome. Yeah, we were talking pre-recording about Dax Shepard with Armchair Expert, his podcast, which I think is one of the best interview shows out there. And he recently had Joseph Gordon-Levitt as a guest, and he talked about that show. I've not jumped over to check that one out, but if you say it's awesome, I might have to.
I do.
Cool. All right, I got one of mine, and I'm going to cheat a little bit because this is not something that I've been doing, but something I'm about to start again, and I'm going to a little confessional / hype for a friend of the show. Okay. He is a 2-time previous guest of the Podcast Digest. Longtime listeners are going to remember this guy. His show had kind of went away but come back rebranded. This is the one and only Dana Buckler. Dana Buckler used to have a show called How Is This Movie? That was one of my favorite independent podcast pleasures. That's why he was a guest twice. Dana is an awesome guy. He did great and amazing work reviewing / commenting / summarizing / digesting all kinds of great movies. Well, the show kind of went through a rebrand and came back as the Dana Buckler Show. And he's got co-hosts now, and it's a slightly different thing, but it's still Dana. Here's the thing, and this is my confession. I lost the RSS and didn't even find this out until weeks after it happened, and I've not gotten back on the train yet until today. And as we sit here and record, folks, we're on the evening of September 24th. We'll break the time continuum, whatever. It's the evening of September 24th. Just yesterday, or earlier today, or whatever it was, I think it was last night, Dana tweeted out that he'd gotten an interview with one of his heroes and showed a picture with him and this person and said that they had done an interview for an upcoming episode, and I almost lost my mind as a fellow independent podcaster who has always tried to strive for great interviews. This other guy who's been a guest on my show just booked and completed an interview with John Travolta.
I did a double take when I saw the picture. I was like, wait, who?
It blew my mind. The episode is not out as we record, so I've not heard this episode yet. I wanted to mention this here only for this reason. Dana has been a previous show guest twice. I don't know him, quote, personally, other than those 2 episodes, other than to say he seems like a really great guy, and I used to love How Is This Movie? I have a shirt, folks. I have a podcast shirt. I bought Dana Buckler's How Is This Movie shirt, and I still wear it every couple of weeks. It's in my closet. So this is a good guy. It's called The Dana Buckler Show. There's a link in the show notes, and there's an upcoming interview from an independent podcaster that I know who interviewed John Travolta. And if for no other reason, you need to subscribe and check out his show. So how cool is that, Jason?
That is not shooting for the moon. That is getting to the moon.
You know what I mean? I mean, does it get any bigger than that? I mean, as an indie podcaster, can you have a bigger get than John freaking Travolta?
No, but you know what? I will say, I am retroactively nervous for him. Like, what do you ask?
Even though it's over?
He's like, because he's a fan too.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you not fall to pieces? Like,
you were familiar with How Is the Movie, right? You remember that
a little bit, yeah. I mean, it was one of the few. On my Sometimes podcast where I would jump a playlist, I should say, where I would jump in based on the movie.
Sure. Right. That makes sense. And that's sort of what it was. It's kind of very much like the Podcast Digest, right? If you like kind of the topic covered, you would hop over and listen. So I understood that. It's one of the reasons I think him and I kind of hit it off or saw eye to eye pretty regularly. We're sort of doing similar things in the sense that, our audiences were kind of jumping in and out. So, but I was thrilled when I saw that on Twitter, and I retweeted it and commented on it, and I'm so thrilled for him. I feel like reaching out to him again personally and just talking about, offline, no recording. Just, man, what was this like? How did this happen? This is amazing. I want to listen to the episode first because I imagine he's probably going to cover a little bit about that. But I think it's super cool.
I'm speechless. I mean, it's great. It's fantastic.
So, That's your holdover, folks. There are a couple different podcasts, series of episodes, back catalogs, at least for Dana on to check out, and that should hold you over to the next episode of the Podcast Digest. So, Jason, it's been a blast, man. Episode 160 in the can.
It's my third official episode.
Yes,
on the Podcast Digest.
It is,
and I cannot wait until my 30th.
Yeah. Well, we should have cake. We'll have cake then. We'll do a cake, maybe.
I mean, at some point, we need to talk about the fact that, like, we should meet.
Yeah, well, that is something that at some point, we're going to have to do it in person.
We're not entirely that far away.
No, and that's the thing, listeners, you should know. We're, 90 minutes-ish, if
Less
that?
Than that. It's about an hour.
Within an hour of each other geographically, and so many other podcasts co-hosts are not. So we will fix that at some point. I don't know when. I mean, we're not really near a big number at 160, but I am thinking, I don't know, maybe a holiday special, Jason. It doesn't have to be at the holidays, but maybe released at the holidays.
We could do that. We could do that. Or, I mean, 175 special is a nice round number too. But I mean,
but even then, every 2 weeks you're looking at next summer for episodes.
Yeah, no, I forgot about that. Yeah,
but maybe a holiday special. I said, we don't have to do it at the holidays. We could just release it at the holidays.
If you happen to have an idea for a holiday coming up in the next few months that you would like Dan and I to get together for, please hit Dan at the Podcast Digest or myself at Agent Palmer and let us know.
That is at Pod Digest there, buddy.
Oh, yeah. It's at the Palmer Files. I kept the article for my
That's
show.
Okay, folks. Those links are in the show notes as well. So don't listen to us. Read the show notes. Folks, that will do it for episode 160 of the Podcast Digest. Thank you all so much for coming back and checking out this one. Hopefully, next one in 2 more weeks. We were a little bit late on this one. That was totally my fault. But we'll try to get back on our regular fortnightly, bi-weekly schedule. And maybe with an interview, maybe not. We will see. So until next time, for the Podcast Digest and for Jason, my name's Dan Lizzette with the Podcast Digest. See you next time.